My husband came to me at my mother's funeral and asked, "Why does your brother look exactly like me?" I was holding a folded flag of white lilies against my chest when Julian leaned in close enough that I could smell the funeral home's carnation air freshener on his suit, and he whispered the question directly into my ear like it was something shameful, something he'd been holding back all morning. I actually laughed, one short, startled breath, because I thought he was making some strange joke at the worst possible moment, the kind of nervous humor people fall into when grief makes them say ridiculous things. Then I looked at his face and understood he wasn't joking at all. His eyes were fixed across the funeral parlor on my younger brother Silas, who stood near the casket shaking hands with our mother's old coworkers, and Julian's expression had gone pale and strange in a way I'd never seen in 6 years of marriage. I'd been standing beside my husband for 3 hours that morning, greeting relatives I barely remembered and accepting condolences from strangers who claimed to have known my mother better than I did, when Julian first went quiet in that particular focused way he got when something bothered him deeply. My mother, Ilse Voss, had died 11 days earlier from a sudden cardiac event at 63, and the funeral had drawn nearly 100 people through the doors of Ashgrove Memorial Chapel, more than I expected for a woman who mostly kept to herself in her final years. Julian and I had been married for 6 years, together for 8, and he'd met my mother exactly 4 times before that morning, always at holidays, always briefly, never long enough for anyone to notice anything unusual about the shape of her son's face. Silas was 26, 3 years younger than me, tall with the same dark, restless energy our mother used to have when she got excited about something. We'd grown up together in a small house outside town after our father, Anders, left when I was 9 and Silas was 6, disappearing into a new life 2 states away that neither of us ever fully understood or forgave. Our mother raised us mostly alone, working double shifts at a regional insurance office, and Silas and I had the kind of close protective bond siblings develop when they've had to rely on each other more than the adults around them. I'd never once, in 26 years, thought there was anything unusual about how Silas looked, because he'd always simply looked like Silas, like my brother, like family. Julian grabbed my elbow gently and pulled me a few steps away from the receiving line, his voice low and tight when he spoke again. He said it wasn't just a passing resemblance, that Silas had the exact same jawline his father had in old photographs, the same slight gap between his front teeth, the same way of tilting his head when he laughed that Julian said he'd seen 1,000 times in home videos from his own childhood. I told him he was being ridiculous, that grief made people see patterns that weren't really there, that plenty of people share features by pure coincidence. But even as I said it, some small, cold thread of doubt slipped into my chest, because I'd noticed something too, weeks earlier, that I hadn't let myself examine closely until that exact moment. At the reception afterward, held in the chapel's adjoining hall with trays of supermarket sandwiches and lukewarm coffee, I watched Julian watch my brother across the room, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed in a way that made my stomach twist uncomfortably. Silas caught him staring at one point and gave an awkward little wave, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny, and Julian forced a smile back that didn't reach his eyes at all. I pulled my husband aside near the coat closet and asked him directly what exactly he thought he was seeing, and he told me quietly that his own father, Theodore Bramwell, had grown up in this same small town before moving away in his 20s, and that Theodore had mentioned once, years ago, dating someone here before he met Julian's mother. I remember my whole body going still when Julian said that, because a distant, buried memory surfaced from somewhere I hadn't visited in years. When I was maybe 12, cleaning out a closet with my mother, I'd found an old photograph tucked inside a paperback novel, a young man with dark hair standing beside a much younger version of my mother at what looked like a lake somewhere. She'd snatched it from my hand so fast it nearly tore, tucked it back inside the book, and told me sharply that it was nobody, an old friend from before she met my father, and I shouldn't go through her things without asking. I'd forgotten about that photograph completely until Julian said his father's name out loud in that crowded reception hall, and suddenly it felt like the floor had tilted slightly beneath my feet. I told Julian I needed air and walked out to the parking lot alone, my heels sinking slightly into the gravel, my hands shaking as I dialed my mother's old landline number out of pure muscle memory before remembering, with a fresh wave of grief, that nobody would ever answer it again. I stood there for several minutes just breathing, trying to talk myself out of the spiraling thoughts building in my head, telling myself Julian was grasping at strange coincidences during an emotionally overwhelming day, that grief made everyone a little irrational, myself included. But underneath that rationalization sat a harder, colder question I couldn't quite silence, one that had apparently been waiting patiently for years for someone to finally ask it out loud in a room full of witnesses. That night, after the funeral guests had gone home and Silas had left to stay at a hotel near the airport before flying back to his apartment 3 states away, Julian and I sat at our kitchen table in near total silence, the day's exhaustion pressing down on both of us. He finally pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph of his father from decades earlier, a scanned image from an old family album Julian's mother, Corinne, had digitized years back. I stared at the photo for a long time, my throat tightening, because the resemblance wasn't subtle at all once I let myself actually look for it. The jaw, the eyes, the specific curve of the mouth. It was like looking at a slightly older, slightly different version of my own brother's face staring back at me from a photograph taken before either of us was even born. I asked Julian, my voice barely above a whisper, whether he thought his father and my mother had known each other, and he said he honestly didn't know, but that something about the timing bothered him enough that he couldn't just let it go. Theodore Bramwell had grown up in this exact town, attended the same regional high school my mother had, before moving away for college and eventually building a successful construction and development company 2 states over, the same company Julian now worked for as an operations director. I did the math in my head almost automatically, counting backward from Silas's age, landing on a window of time roughly 27 years earlier, right around when my mother would have been in her mid-20s, unmarried, working her first real job at the insurance office downtown. I barely slept that night, lying awake beside Julian while he scrolled silently through old family photos on his phone, both of us caught in the same uncomfortable orbit of a question neither of us wanted to ask directly. The next morning, exhausted and hollow-eyed, I drove to my mother's house to begin the miserable task of sorting through her belongings, and I found myself moving straight toward that same hallway closet from 20 years earlier, before I'd even consciously decided to look for anything. The paperback novel wasn't there anymore, long since donated or discarded over the years, but tucked inside an old shoebox on the top shelf, I found a small bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon, addressed to my mother in handwriting I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, dated almost 27 years earlier, written in careful, looping handwriting that felt distinctly masculine and formal for its time. The letter began with the word Ilse, and was signed at the bottom with a single name that made my stomach drop straight through the floor: Theodore. I sat down hard on the edge of my mother's bed and read through all 6 letters over the next hour, my whole body cold despite the warm afternoon sunlight coming through the window. They described a relationship that had clearly been serious, intimate, and apparently secret, spanning roughly 8 months before ending abruptly with a final letter that mentioned Theodore's engagement to someone named Corinne, and his decision to move away for good. I called Julian from my mother's kitchen, my voice cracking before I'd even finished dialing, and told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and I could hear him breathing unevenly before he finally spoke. He said his parents' wedding anniversary had always been celebrated as though they'd been together for years beforehand, but that he vaguely remembered his mother once mentioning, offhandedly, that Theodore had come back from somewhere unexpectedly right before the wedding, seeming distant and preoccupied for weeks afterward. Neither of us said the word aloud yet, the obvious conclusion sitting heavy and unspoken between us. But I think we both already knew exactly what those letters meant for my brother, for my mother's memory, and for the family we'd both grown up believing we understood completely. Over the following week, I couldn't stop thinking about it, running through old memories on a constant, exhausting loop, searching for clues I might have missed my entire life. I remembered my mother flinching slightly whenever Silas mentioned wanting to trace our father's side of the family for a school project years earlier. I remembered her refusing, gently but firmly, to ever discuss much about her life before she met our legal father, Anders, deflecting every question with vague, practiced answers about wanting to focus on the present instead of the past. I remembered Silas asking her once, half joking, why he didn't look anything like our dad in old photographs, and how she'd laughed it off, saying children rarely look exactly like their parents anyway. Genetics were unpredictable that way. I finally called Silas on a Thursday evening, my hands shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the counter and put him on speaker just to keep from dropping it. I told him everything: the letters, the photograph from my childhood, Julian's reaction at the funeral, the uncomfortable math I couldn't stop doing in my head no matter how hard I tried. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line before Silas finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since we were kids. He asked if I was suggesting our entire understanding of our own father was wrong, and I told him honestly that I didn't know for certain, but that I thought we deserved to find out rather than keep wondering for the rest of our lives. We agreed, both of us crying quietly by the end of that call, that we needed real answers rather than speculation built on old letters and a passing resemblance noticed at a funeral. I researched DNA testing services extensively over the following days, eventually landing on a laboratory that specialized in legal-grade paternity and kinship testing rather than the casual consumer genealogy kits, since I wanted results that would hold up to real scrutiny if this went as far as I suspected it might. I scheduled an appointment for Silas and requested a sample directly from Theodore Bramwell himself, though I had no idea yet how I would actually convince a man I'd met only a handful of times to voluntarily submit his DNA for a test that could upend his entire family. Julian offered to handle that part himself, insisting it needed to come from him rather than from me, and I remember the specific, grim determination on his face when he said it. He drove to his parents' house the following weekend under the pretense of a routine visit, and later told me he'd simply asked his father directly, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where Julian had eaten breakfast his entire childhood, whether Theodore had ever known a woman named Ilse Voss from this town decades earlier. Julian said his father's face went through several visible stages of shock, denial, and finally something that looked almost like relief, as though a weight he'd carried silently for nearly 3 decades had finally been set down in front of him. Theodore admitted the affair almost immediately once confronted directly, according to Julian, though he claimed he genuinely hadn't known my mother was pregnant when he left. He said Ilse had never contacted him again after his engagement to Corinne became public, and he'd assumed, if he thought about it at all over the years, that the relationship had simply ended cleanly, with no lasting consequences. Julian told me his father's hands were shaking when he agreed, almost too quickly, to submit a DNA sample, as though some part of him had been waiting decades for exactly this moment to arrive, and finally force a reckoning he'd apparently avoided thinking about for most of his adult life. The testing laboratory, a facility called Meridian Genetic Diagnostics, required both samples to be collected under proper chain of custody protocols, since we wanted results that could potentially matter legally down the road. I drove Silas to the collection site myself, both of us silent for most of the trip, and watched through a small window as a technician swabbed the inside of his cheek and sealed the sample into a labeled tamper-evident bag. Theodore submitted his sample separately at a partner facility near his own home, and the laboratory informed us the results would take approximately 10 business days to process, given the additional verification steps required for legal-grade testing. Those 10 days felt like the longest stretch of time I'd experienced since childhood, each day bringing a fresh wave of anxious speculation that made it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. I barely functioned at my job as a claims coordinator at a regional healthcare company, missing deadlines for the first time in years, staring blankly at my computer screen while my mind ran through every possible outcome and what it might mean for my brother, my marriage, and the memory of a mother I could no longer ask directly. Julian and I barely spoke about anything else during that window, our normal conversations about work and weekend plans replaced entirely by anxious, circular discussions about what we would do once the results finally arrived. On the 9th day, a Wednesday morning, Silas called me while I was still in bed, his voice tight and strange, saying the laboratory had emailed him the results a day earlier than expected. I told him not to open it alone, that we should be together when he read it, and I drove to his hotel immediately, still in pajama pants, my heart hammering the entire way there. We sat together on the edge of his hotel bed, his laptop open between us, both of us staring at an unopened email from Meridian Genetic Diagnostics with a subject line that simply read, Kinship Analysis Results, Case Reference 4419. Silas's finger hovered over the trackpad for nearly a full minute before he finally clicked it open. The report used clinical, careful language, but the conclusion at the top was impossible to misread or soften in any way. Based on the genetic markers analyzed, the probability of paternity between Theodore Bramwell and Silas Voss was calculated at 99.98%, a number the laboratory's accompanying letter described as conclusive evidence of a biological parent-child relationship. I read that sentence 3 times before it fully landed, my hands cold, my chest tight, watching my brother's face crumble slowly beside me as 26 years of assumed identity quietly rearranged itself into something entirely different. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We just sat there together on that anonymous hotel bedspread, holding hands the way we used to as kids when our mother worked late and the house felt too big and too quiet. I called Julian from the parking lot afterward, my voice unsteady, and told him the results confirmed everything the letters and the resemblance had already suggested. He was quiet on the phone for a long moment before saying he needed to tell his mother, Corinne, before word somehow reached her from anyone else, and I could hear the dread in his voice at the prospect of that conversation. Corinne Bramwell had been married to Theodore for 26 years, had raised Julian and his younger sister alongside him, and had no idea, as far as either of us knew, that her husband's love affair from before their marriage had produced a son who'd been living an entire life 2 states away, without any of them knowing he existed. Julian told his mother that same evening, sitting with her in the same kitchen where Theodore had confessed to him days earlier, and he said the conversation was one of the hardest of his entire life. Corinne reportedly sat in stunned silence for several minutes before asking only one question, whether Theodore had known about the pregnancy at the time, and whether he'd known anything about Silas's existence in the 26 years since. Julian told her honestly that his father claimed he hadn't known, that Ilse had disappeared from his life completely after the engagement became public, but Corinne's expression apparently made it clear she wasn't entirely certain she believed that explanation, and honestly, neither was I. I contacted a family law attorney the following week, a woman named Odalis Ferreira with nearly 2 decades of experience handling paternity and inheritance disputes, because Silas and I needed to understand what these results actually meant beyond the emotional devastation of learning the truth. Odalis explained, sitting across from us in her modest downtown office, that a confirmed biological paternity relationship could carry real legal weight depending on how the involved parties chose to proceed, particularly regarding inheritance rights, potential retroactive child support claims, and the broader question of whether Silas wished to be legally recognized as Theodore's son on official records. She was careful and measured throughout the consultation, never pushing us toward any particular decision, just laying out the landscape of what was actually possible now that the biological truth had been established beyond reasonable doubt. Silas sat mostly silent through that meeting, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, occasionally asking quiet questions about timelines and processes, but offering little about what he actually wanted from any of it emotionally. Afterward, sitting in my car in the parking garage, he finally broke down completely, saying he didn't know how to process the fact that the man he'd called dad for 26 years, our absent, imperfect, but at least present father Anders, wasn't biologically connected to him at all, while a stranger he'd shaken hands with exactly once at our mother's funeral apparently was. I held him while he cried, both of us grieving something that felt impossible to name properly, a loss layered on top of the fresh loss of our mother that neither of us had fully processed yet. Theodore reached out directly to Silas about 2 weeks after the results came back, sending a long, carefully worded email that Silas forwarded to me before responding to it himself. Theodore wrote that he took full responsibility for the situation, that he wanted to build some kind of relationship if Silas was open to it, and that he was prepared to discuss whatever practical arrangements Silas felt were appropriate given the circumstances. I remember reading it and feeling a strange, conflicted mixture of cautious hope and deep suspicion, because something about the timing and careful legal phrasing of the message felt less like genuine emotional outreach and more like a man protecting himself from potential future liability. That suspicion crystallized into something much darker about a month later, when Julian discovered, entirely by accident while reviewing old company financial records for his own work, that Theodore had quietly transferred a significant block of shares in Bramwell Development out of his own name and into a newly created trust just 3 days after Silas's DNA results came back. Julian brought the documents to me one evening, his face pale, explaining that the timing was almost certainly not a coincidence, that his father appeared to be restructuring his assets specifically to shield the majority of his estate from any potential inheritance claim Silas might eventually pursue, whether or not Silas had any actual intention of doing so. I felt something shift hard in my chest when Julian told me that, a cold, clarifying anger replacing the tentative hope I'd allowed myself to feel about Theodore's earlier email. It wasn't just that he'd hidden an entire son for 26 years, or that he'd let my mother carry that secret completely alone until the day she died without ever acknowledging what he'd done. It was that the moment real accountability became even theoretically possible, his very first move had been to protect his money rather than reach out with any genuine remorse. I called Odalis the next morning and told her everything, and she said asset restructuring immediately following a paternity confirmation was, in her professional experience, an extremely common and legally significant red flag that courts took quite seriously when evaluating claims of bad faith. Odalis recommended we move quickly to formally document Silas's biological relationship to Theodore through the courts before any further asset transfers could complicate matters, explaining that establishing legal paternity would create a documented record protecting Silas's potential inheritance rights regardless of what Theodore tried to do with his estate planning in the meantime. Silas was hesitant at first, saying he didn't want this to look like he was chasing money from a man he'd never even known existed until a few weeks earlier. But Odalis gently pointed out that formalizing the legal relationship wasn't about greed. It was about protecting himself from being deliberately erased a second time by the same man who'd already spent 26 years pretending he didn't exist. We filed the paternity petition in family court about 6 weeks after the funeral, and Theodore's attorney responded almost immediately with an aggressive countermove that neither Silas nor I had anticipated. They argued that even if biological paternity was scientifically confirmed, Theodore had never established any parental relationship with Silas, had never provided financial support, and therefore bore no legal or moral obligation toward him whatsoever under the relevant statutes. Reading that filing felt like a fresh wound layered directly on top of the old one, watching a team of expensive lawyers construct a formal, legally sound argument for why a man could simply walk away from the consequences of his own choices, as long as he'd successfully hidden them for long enough. Odalis wasn't rattled by the countermove at all, explaining calmly that this was a fairly standard opening position in cases like this, designed to test how serious we were about pursuing the claim before offering any kind of settlement. She began building a more comprehensive case, requesting Theodore's full financial records through formal discovery, gathering the original letters my mother had kept for nearly 3 decades, and consulting with a forensic accountant named Priya Rasmussen to trace the timeline of the recent asset transfers and determine whether they constituted deliberate fraudulent concealment under state law. Priya's initial review confirmed what Julian had already suspected, that the trust transfer had occurred within 72 hours of the DNA results being finalized, a timeline she described in her preliminary report as, in her professional opinion, virtually impossible to explain as ordinary financial planning coincidence. While the legal case slowly built momentum behind the scenes, my marriage to Julian began showing serious strain under the weight of everything happening around us. He was caught in an impossible position, loving his father despite everything, working directly for the family company Theodore, still technically controlled, while simultaneously trying to support me and Silas through a legal fight against that same man. We started arguing more than we ever had in 8 years together, small disagreements about scheduling or chores spiraling quickly into much larger conversations about loyalty, family, and whether Julian could truly stand fully behind Silas while still working under his father's company and attending Sunday dinners at his parents' house, like nothing fundamental had changed. I remember one particularly bad night, about 2 months into the legal proceedings, when Julian came home late from a work dinner with Theodore, smelling faintly of the expensive scotch his father always kept in his office, and admitted that Theodore had asked him directly whether I intended to, as he put it, drag this whole family through the mud over money that rightfully belonged to people who'd actually earned it. I felt something break open in me hearing that secondhand insult repeated back through my own husband's mouth, and I asked Julian point blank whether he agreed with his father's framing of the situation. He hesitated just long enough before answering that I knew, immediately and painfully, exactly how conflicted he really was underneath his earlier declarations of support. We started marriage counseling the following week with a therapist named Dr. Halden Farrow, who specialized in couples navigating extended family conflict and betrayal trauma. And our early sessions were some of the most difficult conversations Julian and I had ever had in our entire relationship. Dr. Farrow helped us both articulate what we actually needed from each other during this crisis, separate from the larger family drama swirling around us. I needed Julian to stop softening or excusing his father's behavior every time it came up, and Julian needed to feel like supporting Silas and me didn't automatically require him to declare his own father a monster, with no complexity or redeeming qualities whatsoever. It was slow, difficult work, and there were sessions where we left angrier than when we arrived, but gradually something between us started to stabilize again. The case reached a critical point about 4 months after the funeral when Corinne Bramwell, Julian's mother, unexpectedly contacted Odalis' office directly, requesting a private meeting without Theodore's knowledge. I sat in on that meeting alongside Silas, both of us tense and uncertain what to expect, and Corinne arrived looking exhausted but resolute, carrying a thick folder of her own financial documents she said she'd been quietly gathering for weeks. She told us she'd hired her own divorce attorney, a man named Griffin Okonjo, and intended to file for divorce from Theodore regardless of how the paternity case resolved, because she couldn't continue living with a man who'd not only betrayed her decades earlier, but had spent the recent months trying to hide assets rather than take basic responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. Corinne told Silas, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion underneath it, that she wanted him to know she held absolutely no anger toward him personally, that whatever Theodore had done was entirely his own choice and his own failure, and that she hoped, eventually, they might have some kind of relationship separate from the man who'd hurt both of them in different ways. Silas seemed genuinely moved by that, more than he had been by anything Theodore himself had said or done throughout the entire ordeal, and I watched something in my brother's posture ease slightly for the first time in months, like a small, unexpected weight had finally been lifted rather than added to everything else he was carrying. Corinne's decision to divorce Theodore, combined with her willingness to provide financial documentation supporting our case, changed the entire trajectory of the legal proceedings almost overnight. Her attorney and Odalis began coordinating informally, sharing relevant information that strengthened both cases simultaneously, and Priya's forensic accounting work expanded to trace not just the recent trust transfer, but a broader pattern of financial maneuvering Theodore had apparently engaged in over several years, likely anticipating that his affair and its consequences might eventually surface and cost him control over significant portions of his company. The picture that emerged wasn't just a man who'd made a painful mistake decades earlier, it was a man who'd spent years quietly protecting himself from any form of accountability whatsoever, regardless of who got hurt in the process. Theodore's attorney reached out to Odalis about 6 weeks later, requesting a settlement conference, clearly recognizing that between the paternity case, Corinne's cooperating divorce filing, and the mounting forensic evidence of deliberate asset concealment, continuing to fight publicly in court was becoming a serious liability for both his reputation and his company's standing with investors and business partners. We met in a conference room at Odalis' office on a bright, cold morning in late autumn, Theodore arriving alone, looking noticeably older and more diminished than the confident, composed man I remembered from occasional family gatherings over the years. He barely made eye contact with Silas throughout the entire meeting, his attention fixed mostly on the documents spread across the table in front of him. The settlement negotiations took most of that day, with Odalis and Theodore's attorney moving back and forth between separate rooms, while Silas and I waited, tense and mostly silent, in a small side office down the hall. By late afternoon, Odalis came in with a proposed agreement that included formal legal acknowledgement of paternity, a substantial financial settlement reflecting both retroactive support considerations and Silas's rightful share of family assets, and a written statement Theodore had agreed to provide acknowledging his responsibility in keeping Silas's existence hidden for 26 years. It wasn't a criminal case. There was no possibility of jail time or formal charges, but the financial and reputational consequences were significant enough that Silas finally, after reading through every page carefully with Odalise beside him, agreed to sign. Theodore's business partners learned about the situation shortly after the settlement became part of the public divorce filing between him and Corinne, since divorce proceedings in our state became part of the public record once finalized. A local business journal ran a brief story about the divorce and the unusual paternity dispute tangled up within it. And within weeks, two of Theodore's longtime investment partners quietly withdrew their financial backing from a major development project Bramwell Development had been counting on to expand into a neighboring county. Julian told me his father's standing within the company he'd built over 3 decades had shifted almost overnight. Board members who'd once deferred to him automatically now questioning his judgment and asking pointed questions about what else might have been hidden over the years. Julian eventually made the difficult decision to leave his position at Bramwell Development entirely, about 5 months after the funeral, taking a similar operations role at a competing firm across the state instead. He told me it wasn't just about the professional discomfort of working under his father during such a public scandal. It was that he'd realized, slowly and painfully throughout our counseling sessions with Dr. Farrow, that continuing to build his own career inside his father's company felt like an implicit endorsement of everything Theodore had done, both the original affair and the subsequent decades of silence and the recent attempts at financial concealment. Leaving cost him seniority and a significant pay cut initially, but he said it was the first time in months he'd felt like he could look at himself honestly in the mirror. Silas used a portion of his settlement to finally finish the graduate degree in environmental engineering he'd put on hold years earlier due to financial constraints, enrolling in a program back in our home state so he could be closer to me during what remained an incredibly difficult emotional adjustment period. He started seeing his own therapist, a counselor named Bevan Okafor, who specialized in identity and family of origin issues, working through the complicated grief of essentially losing 2 fathers within the same year, the man who'd raised him imperfectly but consistently, and the biological father who'd apparently known nothing about him for over 2 decades, and then prioritized protecting his money the moment the truth surfaced. Corinne and Silas developed a cautious but genuine relationship over the following months, meeting for coffee every few weeks, slowly building something neither of them had expected but both seemed to find meaningful. She told him stories about Theodore's side of the family, about grandparents Silas had never known existed, about a genetic predisposition towards certain health conditions that turned out to be medically relevant information he'd never had access to before. It wasn't a replacement for the mother we'd lost, and it wasn't some fairy tale reconciliation with the biological father who'd ultimately disappointed him in nearly every way that mattered, but it was something real and unexpected growing out of the wreckage of everything else. I struggled the most, honestly, with reconciling the mother I'd known my entire life with the young woman in those letters, 26 years old, apparently deeply in love with a man who ultimately chose someone else and left her to raise the consequences completely alone. I spent hours some nights going through the rest of her belongings, finding small clues scattered throughout decades of her life that I'd never noticed before. A specific song she always changed the radio station to skip past, a particular kind of flower she never wanted in the house, despite loving gardening otherwise. Small fragments of grief she'd apparently carried silently for nearly 3 decades without ever once burdening either of her children with the full weight of it. I started my own individual therapy alongside the couple's counseling with Julian, working with a grief counselor named Odeline Vance who helped me understand that my mother's silence, however painful its consequences turned out to be, had likely come from a place of genuine protection rather than deception for its own sake. Odeline helped me see that Ilsa had probably spent years terrified that the truth would somehow damage her relationship with Silas, or complicate his sense of identity, or drag both her children into exactly the kind of painful legal and emotional upheaval we ultimately experienced anyway once the truth came out on its own timeline, instead of hers. Understanding that didn't erase my anger completely, but it softened it into something closer to grief, which felt more honest and more survivable than rage alone. About 8 months after the funeral, Julian and I sat down together and had the most honest conversation of our entire marriage, working through everything that had happened, the strain, the arguments, his own complicated loyalty to a father who'd ultimately proven himself deeply flawed, and my own struggle to separate my anger at Theodore from any residual resentment I sometimes unfairly directed at Julian simply because they shared blood. We decided, with Dr. Farrow's guidance, to actively recommit to the marriage rather than let the crisis quietly erode it, scheduling a small renewal ceremony with just our closest friends and, notably, without either Theodore or Corinne present, a boundary we both agreed was necessary for our own healing regardless of how either parent felt about it. 1 year after my mother's funeral, almost to the exact date, Silas graduated with his master's degree in environmental engineering, and I sat in the audience watching him cross the stage with a fierce, complicated pride that felt tangled up with a full year of grief, discovery, betrayal, and slow, difficult healing. Corinne sat 2 rows behind me, having driven 3 hours to attend, and afterward the three of us went to dinner together, an oddly peaceful evening that would have seemed impossible to imagine standing in that funeral parlor exactly a year earlier. Theodore wasn't there, hadn't been invited, and Silas told me later that evening he didn't feel much of anything about that absence anymore, which felt, in its own strange way, like the truest form of closure any of us had managed to find.